There is a moment in every experiment when a scientist crosses a line they cannot uncross. Sometimes that line is obvious. Sometimes it's invisible, drawn only in the suffering of another human being. And sometimes the people who crossed it never even believed they had done anything wrong. This is not a story about monsters. That would be too easy. This is a story about ordinary people, ordinary institutions, ordinary science, and the extraordinary damage it left behind on minds that were never the same again. Some of the men and women in this story had names that made headlines. Others were never given the dignity of being named at all. They were patients, prisoners, soldiers, students, children. And in each case, they became something else entirely. Subjects, objects, data points in a file that someone, somewhere, eventually tried to make disappear. But history has a long memory, and the forgotten have a way of being found. The 20th century was the age of science. After 2 world wars, humanity had seen what destruction looked like at scale. Governments and institutions turned to science, not just to build weapons, but to understand the human mind itself. The questions being asked were enormous. What makes a man break? What makes a soldier obey? What separates loyalty from treason? Sanity from madness, the self from its own dissolution? These were not idle questions. They were questions with funding, with facilities, with clearance levels that most people would never know existed. And in that environment, part ambition, part fear, part genuine scientific curiosity, the conditions were created for some of the most disturbing experiments ever conducted on human beings. We are going to walk through several of them, not to sensationalize, not to shock, but because forgetting is its own kind of crime. Let's begin in the early 1950s. The Cold War had settled into something long and suffocating. The United States government had one particular fear that kept intelligence officials awake at night: the idea that the Soviet Union and China had developed techniques to manipulate the human mind, to break a man's wheel, to make him say things, believe things, confess to things that weren't true. The Korean War had produced a wave of American posts who, after being captured and held by North Korean and Chinese forces, came home saying strange things, renouncing their own country, praising communism. Some refused to come home at all. The American intelligence community called it brainwashing. And in that fear, they made a decision that would haunt the country for decades. If the enemy had the ability to break a man's mind, then the United States needed to know how. That they needed to master it themselves. The program had several names over the years, but the one that history remembers is MK, officially approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles in April 1953. MKUltra was not a single experiment. It was an umbrella, a vast, sprawling network of over 150 research projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and safe houses across the United States and Canada. The scientists involved included some of the most respected names in psychiatry, psychology, and pharmacology. Many of them knew exactly what they were doing. Some of them, it seems, convinced themselves they didn't. The goal was precise and terrible: to find a method for breaking and controlling the human mind, to induce amnesia, to erase identity, to implant false beliefs, to make a subject do what they were told and remember nothing. And the primary weapon they chose was a drug that very few people had heard of at the time: LSD. In the early 1950s, lysergic acid ethylamide was not yet a symbol of the counterculture. It was a mystery, a powerful, unpredictable compound discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1943. Its effects on the mind were profound and disorienting, and to CIA researchers, that disorientation looked like possibility. If LSD could shatter a person's grip on reality, perhaps it could be weaponized. Perhaps a subject dosed with enough of the drug, subjected to the right conditions, could be made vulnerable, suggestible, controllable. What followed was not science, not in any ethical sense of the word. CIA operatives began dosing individuals without their knowledge or consent, not just enemy agents or prisoners, American citizens, military personnel, mental patients, sex workers, ordinary people who had no idea what was being done to them. There is a name that appears again and again when MKUltra is discussed. Frank Olson, a biochemist working for the U.S. Army's biological warfare program. Olson was dosed with LSD without his knowledge at a CIA retreat in November 1953. Within days, he became severely psychologically distressed, and on November 28, 1953, he fell from the window of a New York City hotel room on the 13th floor. His death was ruled a suicide. His family was told it was a breakdown, a personal crisis. The truth that he had been secretly drugged by the United States government was not revealed to them for more than 20 years. When his body was exhumed in 1994, forensic investigators found evidence of a blow to the head before the fall. The full truth of Frank Olson's death may never be known. But what is known is this: a man was dosed without his consent, deteriorated psychologically, and died, and the people responsible spent decades ensuring his family never learned why. He was not the only one. The LSD experiments were just one thread in MKUltra's web. Others were darker. At McGill University in Montreal, Canada, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron was conducting research that he believed would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was the founder of the World Psychiatric Association. He had testified at the Nuremberg trials as an expert on the psychology of the Nazi leadership. He was, by every measure, one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world, and he was conducting experiments on his patients that were, in every meaningful sense, torture. Cameron believed that certain mental illnesses could be treated by wiping the mind clean, erasing its contents like a blackboard, and then rebuilding the personality from scratch. He called it psychic driving, and he pursued it with a devotion that crossed every line that medicine had established for the protection of patients. His subjects were admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital operating out of a Victorian mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal in Montreal. Many of them had come for relatively minor issues: anxiety, depression, marital problems. They had no idea what they were signing up for. Cameron would place patients into prolonged, medically induced sleep, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. While they slept, he would play recorded messages on a loop, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of repetitions. Messages designed to break down their existing personality and instill new beliefs, new behaviors, new identities. He combined this with massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, far beyond what any accepted medical practice recommended. He combined it with experimental drugs, with sensory deprivation, with LSD and other hallucinogens. All of it without the knowledge or genuine consent of his patients. The results were not what Cameron had hoped. They were catastrophic. Many of his patients emerged from treatment having lost vast portions of their memories, their identities, their ability to function. People who had entered the hospital as functioning adults, capable parents, spouses, professionals, left unable to remember their own childhoods, unable to recognize their own children, incontinent, regressed to childlike states, sometimes permanently. Cameron died in 1967, largely believing in the validity of his work. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s that the full extent of what had been done was uncovered, and that it was revealed the CIA had been funding his research through a front organization, viewing his work as part of MKUltra's broader mission. When that came to light, the Canadian government eventually provided compensation to some of the survivors and their families, but no amount of money could give back what had been taken. Memory is not a possession. It is a self, and those people had had their selves dismantled by a man who believed he was helping them. But the horror of this era was not confined to government programs and secret labs. Some of the most disturbing psychological experiments in history were conducted openly, in universities, by researchers whose names appear in every psychology textbook ever written. In 1971, a young psychology professor at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo conducted what became known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. The setup seems straightforward enough. 24 male college students, selected for their psychological stability and absence of criminal history, were randomly assigned to play either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison built in the basement of Stanford's psychology department. The experiment was planned to run for 2 weeks. It had to be stopped after 6 days. What Zimbardo witnessed, And what he and his team also became complicit in was something that overturned fundamental assumptions about human nature. The students playing guards did not remain students playing guards. They became, within days, genuinely cruel. They humiliated prisoners, forced them into degrading exercises, deprived them of sleep, used psychological manipulation and intimidation with an enthusiasm that had not been present at the start. The students playing prisoners did not remain students playing prisoners either. They began to break. One had to be removed from the experiment on the second day, suffering acute psychological distress. Others became passive, withdrawn, depressed. One began to act so bizarrely that Zimbardo himself initially believed he was faking. Wasn't, and Zimbardo, who had appointed himself the superintendent of the simulated prison, became so absorbed in his role. Yet he failed to see what was happening with any clinical distance until his girlfriend, Christina Muslim, visited the experiment on the 5th day and was so disturbed by what she saw that she confronted him. "What you're doing to those boys is terrible," she told him. The experiment was terminated the following morning. What the Stanford prison experiment revealed, or appeared to reveal, was deeply unsettling. That ordinary people, placed in environments of power and powerlessness, could become perpetrators and victims with terrifying speed. That identity is not fixed. That the situation shapes the person, often more than the person shapes the situation. The findings have been debated, challenged, and reanalyzed for decades. Some researchers have questioned the methodology. Some have suggested that Zimbardo's own involvement as a role player contaminated the results. Some of the original participants have, in later years, suggested they were playing along more than they were genuinely transforming. But none of that erases what happened in that basement. The distress was real. The suffering was real. The ethical violations, the failure to protect participants from psychological harm, the failure to maintain research neutrality were real. And the questions it raised about human nature remain unanswered. A year before the Stanford prison experiment, another study had raised different but equally disturbing questions about the human capacity for cruelty. And that study had been running, in various forms, since 1961. Stanley Milgram was a social psychologist at Yale University. His question was one that had been haunting the world since the end of World War II. How had ordinary Germans participated in the Holocaust? How had ordinary men, fathers, neighbors, people who had never shown exceptional cruelty, become capable of murder on an industrial scale? The easy answer, the comforting answer, was that they had been monsters, that something fundamental had been wrong with them. Milgram did not believe the easy answer. His experiment was deceptively simple. Participants were recruited under the pretense that they would be helping study the effects of punishment on learning. When they arrived at the laboratory, they were introduced to another person, apparently a fellow participant, in fact a trained actor, and were told one of them would be the teacher and one the learner. The assignment was rigged. The real participant was always the teacher. The learner was taken to an adjacent room, where they were strapped into a chair and connected to electrodes. The teacher sat before a large shock generator with switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, with ominous descriptors at the higher end. Danger, severe shock, and at the final 2 switches. Simply, every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed by an authority figure, a researcher in a gray lab coat, to administer a shock and to increase the voltage with each subsequent error. The shocks were not real, but the teacher did not know that, and as the voltages increased, the actor in the next room began to cry out, to bang on the wall, to complain of a heart condition, and eventually, to go silent. When participants hesitated or tried to stop, the researcher would calmly instruct them to continue. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before conducting the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists to predict how many participants would administer the maximum shock of 450 volts, a level that, had these shocks been real, would likely have been fatal. The psychiatrists predicted that fewer than 1% would do so, that only the most pathological, sadistic individuals would be willing to go that far. They were wrong. In the initial study, 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. Ordinary people, people with no history of violence, People who, in many cases, were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, begging the researcher to let them stop. And yet they continued, because an authority figure in a gray lab coat told them to. The implications were, and remain, devastating. Milgram had not found a nation of monsters. He had found something far more frightening. He had found that the capacity for participation in atrocity lies dormant in the vast majority of human beings, waiting for the right circumstances, the right authority, the right diffusion of responsibility, the right context, to wake it up. The ethics of his experiment are also complex. Participants were deceived. Many reported lasting psychological distress. They had been forced, in a way, to confront something terrible about themselves. Not a fictional evil, but a genuine willingness they had not known they possessed. Milgram believed the knowledge was worth the cost. Not everyone agreed. Beyond the universities and the government programs, there existed a more silent category of horror. The experiments conducted not on soldiers, prisoners, or student volunteers, but on the most vulnerable members of society. The children, the institutionalized, the people whose voices had the least power to be heard. In the late 1930s, a graduate student at the University of Iowa named Wendell Johnson conducted what would come to be known as the monster study. Johnson had a theory about stuttering, that it was not a neurological condition, but a learned behavior, reinforced by the negative reactions of people around the stuttering child. He wanted to test this theory by inducing stuttering in children who did not yet have it. His subjects were 22 orphaned children at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Half were given positive, supportive speech therapy. The other half, including several who had no speech problems at all, were subjected to relentlessly negative feedback. They were told they were stutterers, that their speech was defective, that they should stop talking if they couldn't speak correctly. They were belittled and criticized every time they opened their mouths. Many of the children in the negative group developed serious, lasting speech problems. Several who had had no issues at the beginning of the experiment began to stutter. Some were psychologically damaged in ways that persisted throughout their lives. The study was suppressed. Johnson never published it. He appears to have understood, on some level, what it would mean for his reputation if it became known. It did not become publicly known until 2001, when a journalist uncovered the records. By then, Johnson had been dead for 4 decades. The orphans, those who had survived, were elderly. Some were still living with the consequences of what had been done to them as children. In 2007, the state of Iowa settled a lawsuit brought by 6 of the surviving subjects and the descendants of others for nearly $1 million. No amount of money restored the words they had lost. There is a thread that runs through all of these stories. It is not evil, exactly, not in the simple, cartoonish sense. It is something more complicated and more disturbing than that. It is the willingness to decide that some people matter less than knowledge, that the homeless, the imprisoned, the mentally ill, the orphaned, the already broken, that these lives are an acceptable price for discovery, that the subject's suffering is less important than the researcher's question. Every ethical framework we now use to govern scientific research on human beings. The Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, the Institutional Review Board, the requirement of informed consent. Every single one of these safeguards exists because someone at some point decided that safeguards weren't necessary, and people were destroyed as a result. The Nuremberg Code was written in 1947, in the immediate aftermath of the Nazi medical trials. It established, for the first time, an explicit and legally binding language. That voluntary consent is absolutely essential in any experiment conducted on a human being. MKUltra began 6 years later. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which 400 black American men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated, so researchers could observe the natural progression of the disease, while being told they were receiving treatment, continued until 1972, 25 years after Nuremberg. Well, after effective treatment with penicillin was available and had been withheld from them. The monster study was conducted in 1939. The Cameron experiments continued into the 1960s. The Milgram experiments are still being replicated in modified forms today. We did not learn quickly, and there are those who would argue carefully, soberly, with evidence, that we have not finished learning yet. The files eventually surface, they always do. Sometimes it takes a Freedom of Information request. Sometimes it takes a congressional investigation. Sometimes it takes a survivor living long enough to be believed. Sometimes it takes the death of the people who had the most to lose from the truth. But the files surface, and what they reveal, every time, is not a clean story of monsters and victims. It is something messier. Scientists who genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge. Governments that genuinely believed national security justified everything. Doctors who had taken an oath to do no harm and found 100 ways to rationalize breaking it. And at the center of every file, every report, every declassified document, to the people who had no choice, the children in the orphanage, who didn't know what was happening to them, the psychiatric patients who trusted the men in white coats, the prisoners who had already lost their freedom before they were asked to lose something more. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their suffering deserves to be understood. Not as data. Not as case studies. Us? Live. The question that haunts all of this is not simply what was done. It is what we do with the knowledge. The human mind is the most complex thing we have ever attempted to understand. We have barely begun. And the history of the attempts we have made, the honest history, the unredacted history, is full of wreckage. It would be comforting to believe that the wreckage belongs entirely to another era. That we have learned, that the frameworks and the oversight and the ethical review processes have made us immune to the temptations that drove Cameron and Johnson and the architects of MKUltra. But comfort is not always earned. The same question that drove those experiments has not gone away. What makes a mind break? What makes a person do what they are told? What is the self, really? And how fragile is it? We are still asking. We are still in laboratories and universities and classified facilities whose contents we may not know for another 50 years, attempting to find out. The forgotten science that broke human minds is not entirely forgotten. It lives in the ethical codes written in response to it. It lives in the people who survived it. It lives in the silence of the ones who didn't. And it lives in the question that every scientist, every government, every institution must answer for itself, not once, but continuously, in every decision about who matters and who doesn't. That question is very old, and we are still, all of us, deciding how to answer it.